Hello, I'm Dr. Rob Steffen, and welcome to the site of ancient Olympia, birthplace of the Olympic Games. Now, ancient Olympia is located in the northwestern Peloponnese, in the region of Elis, and that's kind of in the middle of nowhere. But as we'll see, that's kind of the point here. You see, Olympia was a pan-Hellenic sanctuary dedicated to the god Zeus, and the Olympic Games were also pan-Hellenic in nature. And what that means is that while it may be far from Athens, or Corinth, or Sparta, or Syracuse, it's relatively central within the larger Greek world. And Greeks from all over the Mediterranean would gather here to participate in peaceful competition and to worship at the altar of Olympian Zeus. But as we'll see, Olympia is far more than just a nice stadium. We've got administrative buildings, we've got lodging for the guests, we've got religious temples, we've got training facilities, and we'll take a look at all of those today. So, go ahead, hit the starting blocks, and journey with me as we investigate ancient Olympia. Now, the origins of ancient Olympia are shrouded in mystery, and at the heart of that mystery are the things it's two most famous for, right? We have the ancient Olympic Games, and we have the worship of the cult of Olympian Zeus. And scholars have debated for decades, kind of which came first, the chicken or the egg, right? Was this originally a sporting place in its earliest days, and then the worship of Zeus came up and arose to complement that? Or was it originally a religious sanctuary, and the sports evolved a little bit later to complement and ritualize the worship of Zeus? Now, we know from ancient documents, these victor lists that list all the winners of the first sprint race in the Olympic Games, that those games date back to the early 8th century BC, 776 BC in particular. Our understanding of the earliest days of the worship of Zeus, however, is a little bit more complicated. We don't have texts about that, and instead we have to look at the artifacts. We have small figurines, pieces of pottery, that sort of thing. And from that, we get the sense that the worship of Zeus dates back even further than the 8th century, to the 9th or 10th, or even possibly the Bronze Age. And so what we get the sense for here is that the site of Olympia was originally a religious sanctuary for the god Zeus, and the Olympic Games arose a little bit later as part of the ritual process of the commemoration and worship of Zeus. Now, amazingly, the ancient Olympics lasted for more than 1,000 years, and it wasn't until 393 AD, under one of the Roman emperors, one of the Christian Roman emperors, that they finally banned the games because of their association with the pagan gods. But the legacy lives on today, so let's go ahead, we'll dive a little deeper into the site and check out the monuments and developments of ancient Olympia. Here we are, inside the site of Olympia, in the precinct known as the Altis. Now, the Altis was the religious or sacred precinct at the site of Olympia, and it comes from the local word for grove. And as you can see all around you, right, we're talking about an olive grove. And the way that that olive grove came to be gets back to one of Greek mythology's most famous heroes. That, of course, is Heracles. Now, as you may know, Heracles had to complete nearly 12 impossible labors to expunge the guilt he had for killing his wife and his children in a fit of madness. The fifth of these labors was cleaning out the stables of King Augeas. These hadn't been cleaned in 30 years, and the crap had piled up to the ceiling. But rather than dig this up himself, Heracles said, let's work smarter, not harder. And instead, he dug a canal for the local river, the Alpheus, and he diverted that so it ran through the stables, taking that 30 years of crap along with it. Now, after completing all of his labors, Heracles came back to this spot to give thanks to his father Zeus. There, he marked out the kind of boundaries of the religious precinct, and he planted the first olive tree at the site. And that olive tree, or the branches from it, end up being what the victors of the Olympic Games are given in the form of a crown or a wreath, Stephanos in Greek, as a reward for winning one of the events in the Olympic Games. Heracles had one other contribution as well. He actually demarcated the length of the first sprint race at the Olympics.
That is known as the stadion. And to do this, he marked out 200 back-to-back-to-back steps that ended up stretching around 200 meters. So we can get the sense that his feet were about a meter long each. Seems appropriate for a hero of that stature. But anyway, from this story, we get the origins of the religious area at the site of Olympia and the distance of the very first Olympic race. So come on, let's check out the monuments within. We're still here in the Altus right now, and we're going to talk a little bit about the other myths surrounding the origin of the Olympic Games. And this one's a little more gruesome and a little deadlier. It concerns a Greek hero by the name of Pelops. And what we're looking at to my left over here, not the temple in the background, but the kind of rectangular structure on the ground right there, is known as the Pelopion, or the tomb and monument for the hero Pelops. Now, Pelops comes from a famously cursed family, and his father was a guy by the name of Tantalus. Now, Tantalus was kind of a messed up guy. At one point in time, he actually chopped up his son Pelops and tried to feed him to the gods to test their omniscience. Now, this is kind of a tangent, but the gods figured that one out, all except for Demeter, of course. She was still mourning Persephone, who had been gone down to Hades. And so, anyway, Pelops does get a little bit eaten, but eventually he gets put back together by the gods and goes on his merry way. And as Pelops traverses the Greek world, he ends up in the region right around here, in the nearby town of Pisa. And this was ruled by a guy by the name of King Oenomaus. Now, King Oenomaus had a beautiful daughter, Hippodamia. And Pelops fell in love with her and wanted to marry her. The only problem was that King Oenomaus wasn't very fond of the different suitors. And in order to marry Hippodamia, you would have to defeat King Oenomaus in a chariot race. Only problem here? Oenomaus's horses were given to him by the god Poseidon, so they were magical and swift and fast. They just simply couldn't be beaten. But Pelops had a plan. He ended up going to the stable master of Oenomaus, a guy by the name of Myrtilus, and he got Myrtilus to replace the axles of Oenomaus's chariot. The wooden axles, he replaced those with wax. Now, Myrtilus said he'd do this on one condition, that assuming Pelops won, assuming Pelops got to marry Hippodamia, that Myrtilus would get the first night with her. So, day of the race, right, the chariot race starts, Pelops juts out to a big lead, but then Oenomaus and his magical Poseidon horses are catching up, and just as he's about to pass Pelops, the friction and the heat from the friction on those axles starts to melt the wax. The wheels fly off, and Oenomaus is thrown to his death. So, Pelops wins the race and gets to marry Hippodamia. But when Myrtilus comes to collect his prize, right, that first night with the new bride, Pelops decides he doesn't want to give that up anymore. And he actually throws Myrtilus off a cliff, and as Myrtilus is plunging to his death, he curses Pelops and his family forevermore. This is actually known as the curse of the House of Atreus. You have to take my mythology class in order to learn a little bit more about that. But anyway, as thanks to the god Zeus for helping him with this, and as a way to expunge the guilt of having killed Oenomaus and also Myrtilus, Pelops ends up founding the Olympic Games. And what we see here is after the death of Pelops, he's commemorated as a hero, and that means that people would come to his gravesite, again, which we can see here. It would have been a little mound or tumulus, and they would worship this hero as a way to get some sort of benefit from him from beyond the grave. So, next time you're watching the Olympics, think back to the rather gruesome early days of Pelops and the founding of the Olympic Games. So we've talked a little bit about the origin of the Olympic Games and how the games are dedicated to the god Zeus. But the earliest temple at Olympia here, where we stand right now, is actually dedicated to the goddess Hera. Now, this is one of the oldest stone temples we have in all of Greece, and it dates back to the early 6th century, somewhere around 590 BC. And archaeologists actually think that with this temple, we can see the origin of stone temples. In the earliest days, they think that these architectural components, things like the columns and the architrave, would have actually been made of wood. And over the years, as that wood rotted, they would have been replaced by the stone components. Now, architecturally, you can also see that what we're dealing with here is a classic Doric temple, right? The large, thick columns, the bowl-shaped capitals, the columns that sit directly on the stylobate or platform of the temple. Now, in the earliest days, this would have actually been dedicated to both Zeus and Hera. And about 150 years after the construction of this temple, Zeus ends up getting his own temple way over there. And that's when the temple becomes associated solely with Hera. Now, one more fun fact. For the modern Olympic Games, you know the torch procession? It starts at Olympia, and in fact, it starts right here in this temple. It then passes from person to person, and eventually the torch is lit wherever the games are being held. Gotta say, I'm sure Hera would approve of such a tradition. But come on, let's go check out the Temple of Zeus. Now, by the time that Zeus got his own temple at the site of Olympia, what you're looking at behind me right here, he'd been worshipped at the site for about 500 years. Now, I want you to take a look at this temple and see if you guys can decide what style of Greek architecture this is built in. So take a second, look around, check out the stones, check out the columns, check out the capitals. And if you guessed Doric, you're absolutely right? The large, thick stone columns that sit directly on the stylobate, the bowl-shaped capitals. If this thing would have been complete, you could see in antiquity the triglyphs, the 3 vertical lines, and the metopes with sculptures up above those columns. And it also follows the kind of normal classical layout of a Greek temple. So if we were entering this way, we would go into the pronaos, or the entry vestibule. That would be followed by the naos, or the sanctuary, where the cult statue would be. And then behind that is something known in Greek as the opisthodomos. And that's the treasury where the different votive gifts to the god Zeus would have been kept. Now, let's imagine ourselves inside the naos, or the sanctuary where the cult statue stood. This statue was actually one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It was built by the sculptor Phidias in 435 BC, and it was 41 feet tall, made out of gold and ivory. Chryselephantine is what we call that. It would have been a seated statue of Zeus, and in one hand he held a scepter of power crested by an eagle on top. In the other hand, he held a little statuette of the goddess Nike, goddess of victory. And he would have been clothed in golden robes, and he had a long white flowing beard and hair. And that would have been the kind of centerpiece that people from around the Mediterranean would have come to see so that they could check off one of their 7 wonders of the ancient world. One of the other cool things, we actually have the workshop where this sculpture was created. So come on, let's check that out. One of the coolest things about the Temple of Zeus here at Olympia is that we actually have the workshop in which the cult statue of Zeus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, was designed. And that's where we are right now. This is known as the workshop of Phidias. And Phidias was one of the most famous sculptors in the entire ancient Greek world. He was working in the kind of latter part of the 400s BC, right in the classical period of Greece. And not only did he design the cult statue of Zeus, he also designed the cult statue of Athena Parthenos, which would have stood inside the Parthenon on the Athenian Acropolis. Now, this building might not look like much today, but it served a key role in the construction process. For one, if you can see through that wall right there, we're actually looking at the Temple of Zeus beyond. So Phidias could see where his sculpture would kind of serve its final resting place beyond there. The second thing is that the dimensions of this workshop are designed to exactly mimic those of the sanctuary where the cult statue would stand inside the temple. So not only could he see the temple, he would know exactly how his statue would look once it was placed inside. Now, the workshop of Phidias has also produced some of the most interesting artifacts in all of ancient Greece, and we can see how the construction process would have occurred. So for example, we actually have ceramic molds that would have been used to construct the different parts of the statue. You can see part of a shoulder here, a fold in the toga there, and these would have been used as Phidias put together the statue. We also get a small cup, small ceramic cup. And it doesn't look like much. It's a small black cup, a little bit of black glaze on it. But there's an inscription on this. And in Greek it says, "I belong to Phidias." And so we actually have the cup that the sculptor of one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world might have used to drink his wine out of after a long day of working on the statue of Zeus at Olympia. Now, if you're looking around the workshop of Phidias, and let's say that some of the stuff doesn't look exactly ancient Greek. You can see some Christian crosses over here, some fine scroll work over there. Well, this was actually turned into a Christian church much later in time, and that's one of the reasons it looks so well preserved compared to some of the other monuments today. Ongoing excavations have started to reinvestigate the Christian period, and as you can see from the yellow tags here, they're marking all the elements that would have been used in this medieval Christian church. So kind of keep in mind that as you look at the monuments of ancient Greece, it tends to not just be a single period, right? These are layered throughout time from the Archaic to the Classical to the Hellenistic to the Roman. And then these often take on lives much later beyond. And one final kind of quick tip. If ever, throughout the Mediterranean, you find an incredibly well-preserved ancient monument, something like, say, the Pantheon in Rome, or even the Colosseum. The reason these are so well-preserved is because at some point in time, they were adopted and incorporated actually as a Christian religious monument. That's why they weren't destroyed and dismantled, but rather reused and reinterpreted for new religious purposes. All right, so you know how when we have the modern Olympic Games, right? Cities from around the world, wherever it gets selected, go into hundreds of millions of dollars in debt in order to prepare their city for the Games. And that's not just building the stadiums where the events take place. That's building all the different kind of infrastructure that goes along with it, right? All the hotels and roads and metro systems, that sort of thing. Well, the exact same thing happened in classical antiquity. And what we're looking at right here, right, with the outer colonnade, the inner part of the building, this is known as the Leoneidion. It was built in the latter part of the 300s BC, the 4th century BC, by a guy by the name of Leonidas of Naxos, an island in the Aegean. And he was a rather wealthy and important dude, and he decided that when he came to visit the Games, he needed a nice place to stay. And so kind of what you're looking at is an early version of a luxury hotel. And in the years after Leonidas of Naxos, this would have been used by kind of the most important guests to the Olympic Games for lodging. Now you can see kind of the outer colonnade here. These would have been Ionic columns, right? We've talked mainly about Doric so far. Ionic are the ones with the kind of scrolly things, right? And then on the inner courtyard, you can actually see that framed in traditional Doric columns. Now this got used for a variety of purposes through the years, and actually during the Roman period, they turned the very central courtyard of the Leoneidion, this kind of luxury hotel, into a swimming pool. So it even has some of the amenities that we've got today. Now, not everybody can afford to stay in the luxury hotel of the ancient world. And actually, if you go back beyond the workshop of Phidias there, you can see the kind of lodging for the more common visitors. Think of it more like a regular hotel or even a hostel. But everybody would have needed a place to stay so that they could witness some of the greatest athletes in all of ancient Greece. Now, the tourist infrastructure isn't the only thing you need to have in order to put on a world-class set of games. You also need training facilities for the athletes, and that's where we are right here. This is known as the palestra, and the palestra is where athletes would have trained particularly for combat sports. Now, in order to picture what this would have been like, you need to imagine kind of a covered portico above the columns here, and then different rooms in the back. That's where athletes would get dressed and undressed, kind of anoint the body with oil, and often stay for their training. And then on the interior of the courtyard here, that's actually where the training would occur. And this was particularly for the 3 combat sports of ancient Greece. First, you've got Greco-Roman style wrestling. Second, you've got Greek boxing. And unlike today, you don't actually use gloves. For Greek boxing, you wrap the hands in a little bit of leather, but that's just so that you don't break your knuckles when you're punching the other guy in the face. Third and finally, you've got something known as the pankration. And this is sort of an ancient version of MMA where anything goes. Only 2 rules for the pankration: no biting and no eye gouging. So I'll kind of leave that up to you, all the things that are actually allowed in that sport. So as you look around, kind of imagine the world-class athletes from all over the Mediterranean honing their skills and ready to take those to compete into the stadium at Olympia. Now, while the palestra is where the athletes would have trained for their combat sports, right? Boxing, wrestling, the pankration. Where we are right here, known as a gymnasion, where we get our word gymnasium, is where the athletes would have trained for the running and throwing events. So the sprint, the distance race, as well as things like throwing the javelin and the discus. Now, what I want you to kind of imagine as you look around here is there would have been 2 long tracks. And one of these would have been open to the elements so that in the cooler times of year, you could run around outside in the sun. The other one would have been kind of a covered portico so that during the summer when it's really hot out here at Olympia, you don't need to sweat quite as much. Now, the word gymnasion comes from the Greek word for gymnos, which means nude or naked. And that's because the male citizens here, and it was only male citizens who were allowed to train in the gymnasion, participated both training and in the events in the nude. Well, this is a little strange here, right? People all over the world play sports, but not a lot of us get naked and then go run around. And archaeologists and historians have suggested a couple different reasons this developed in ancient Greece for Greek sport. One is that it provides a sense of equality among the athletes, right? There's nobody who has an advantage because of their equipment. It's simply who's the fastest and the strongest. They're the ones who win. The second is that it is a way of showing that you're not cheating, right? Like there's nothing up anyone's sleeves because there are no sleeves to begin with. The third thing is that this highlights the appreciation of the kind of male body and the male figure. And then last and finally, it's a way of showing one's devotion to the gods, right? Like here at Olympia, we have the god Zeus, and the sport was kind of seen as a way of showing one's appreciation and devotion to the deities. So let's go ahead, put our clothes back on, and head over to the stadium where it all took place. Here we are at a monument known as the Philippeion, the only circular monument within the Altis or sacred precinct at the site of Olympia. Now, the Philippeion is built and dedicated by King Philip II of the Macedonian Argead dynasty. And he built this to commemorate his own victory over the forces of Argos and Thebes at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC. Now, Philip was assassinated 2 years later, but his son, the famed Alexander the Great, completed this monument and then went on to crush the Persian Empire. Now, one final thing before we leave here. The Philippeion gives us a great example of what's known as Ionic architecture, and we can tell that in a couple different ways. The easiest way is to look at the top of the columns there, and you can see that rather than a plain bowl-shaped capital, we have these scrolls, which archaeologists call volutes. That's one of the defining features of the Ionic order. We can also see that the columns themselves are much longer and skinnier than we get with the temples, like the Temple of Hera over here or the Temple of Zeus on the other side. Finally, we can see that these long, skinny columns don't sit directly on the base of the monument. Rather, they have their own pedestals on which they reside. So those are the things you want to look for when you're trying to identify Ionic Greek architecture. Here we are in front of what's known as the Hill of Kronos, the father of Zeus and of the Olympian gods. And it was labeled that by Heracles himself. Now, what's really interesting is in what's in front of the Hill of Kronos. And here we have the foundations of a series of 12 treasuries. And these were somewhat like storage units erected by individual city-states to house the gifts of citizens of the city-state to gods like Zeus and Hera. They were also used, however, to display statues of Olympic victors. So let's say you're a citizen of Athens and you win the sprint race at the Olympic Games. Athens might publicly fund a statue of you and erect it in its treasury here at Olympia. And so what we see going on is actually two different things. First, it highlights the devotion of that city-state to the gods. Second, however, it shows how good they are at sport. And so it's a way to both exhibit piety as well as the kind of friendly competition with other city-states. Now, the final thing here is that these would have also held statues known as zanes. These were bronze statues of the god Zeus. And they were what you had to put up, what you had to pay for and erect if you were caught cheating at the ancient Olympic Games. And much like doping at the Olympics today, this appears to have been a fairly common thing. So in addition to statues of the victors and bronze tripods and statuettes of the gods, you can imagine a series of bronze statues of Zeus that would have been penance for the kind of sin of cheating at the Olympic Games. So kind of picture that as you take in all of Olympia here before we head down into the stadium. We're now here in what's known as the crypt of Olympia. But rather than someplace where dead bodies are kept, this was actually the covered vaulted entranceway for the athletes to make their way into the stadium. So what you have to imagine is that in antiquity, this whole thing would have been covered and the athletes would have been hidden from view. It was built in the 4th century BC, and you can kind of get the sense for how dramatic of an entrance the athletes, world-class athletes from all around the Mediterranean, would have made as they entered the gaze of the spectators in the heart of the stadium at Olympia. So come on, let's go in. All right, so even though the very first Olympics had but a single event, the sprint race, the number of events grew in number and complexity over the years. So you get things like the diaolos, which is the up and back sprint, named after the double flute in ancient Greek culture. You also end up with a long distance run, something like a 10K, and the hoplitodromos, where athletes would actually dress in like full military armor and then do the race. Then you've got things like the pentathlon, a series of 5 events, which included the sprint, but also included things like the discus throw, the javelin throw, the long jump, and wrestling. And wrestling was just one of 3 different combat sports. You've got that, you've got Greek-style boxing, and then you've also got the pankration, a kind of ancient version of modern MMA fighting. Now that may pale in comparison to the kind of over 400 individual events at the Olympics today, but it must have put on quite the show for the spectators sitting on the grassy slopes. So, if you came to watch the ancient Olympic Games, you'd certainly see a wide variety of events in the stadion here. But you're thinking, watch the games, like where are you going to watch from? There aren't any seats here. Well, that's because in antiquity, the visitors and spectators would have sat on the grassy slopes themselves. In fact, it wouldn't look very much different than it does today. Now, the box seats, the only box seats that you see right here, these would have been reserved for the judges, right? The officials who are watching to ensure fair play. And the only other embellishment across the way over here, that stone pedestal, that was reserved for the seating of one of the high priestesses in the surrounding area. Now, that high priestess was actually the only woman allowed to watch the Olympic Games. The rest of it was reserved for men. And if you were a woman and you were caught attending the games, you weren't just kicked out. You were taken out and then thrown off of a cliff. Seems a little extreme for watching a few guys run naked back and forth along the track. But the takeaway point here is that it looks very much like it does today, right? You'd be sitting on the grassy slopes, hanging out with your friends, getting food and drinks from the vendors, and watching the athletes as the center of attention. Now, if you were lucky enough to be one of the winners at the ancient Olympic Games, well, guess what? You didn't get anything monetarily valuable. No gold, no silver, nothing like that. Instead, you got a simple olive wreath cut from one of the branches of one of the olive trees that Heracles built way back in the days of legend. But that doesn't mean you weren't commemorated. Your home city-state might do something like build a statue of you and put it up in one of the treasuries here at Olympia. Or they might commemorate a poet, somebody like the famous Pindar, to record your heroic deeds in song for generations to come. And the fact that we still know the names of the victors, more than 2,500 years later, and the fact that we still come to Olympia today to witness where it all started, and the fact that we've even recreated our own set of Olympic Games, well, that means that commemoration is working pretty well. So when you think about sport, either in the ancient or modern world, I want you to kind of remember, right? This is more than just something we do for fun. This gives athletes the opportunity to come together and compete peacefully, rather than competing on the deadly battlefield. And it gives city-states the opportunity to come together to compete to see who has the greatest athletes, but also to unify and to build bonds about what it means to be a Greek. It allows them to come together and build political and economic alliances, and those help shape the ancient Greek world. And so, as we kind of conclude here, even though the ancient Olympics may be long dead, the idea of peaceful competition, of athletes from city-states and countries all across the world coming together for peaceful competition, well, that absolutely lives on. So, as we take off, I very much hope to see you again, sooner than the next Olympics, 4 years down the road.